Thank you for joining us for this webinar titled Governance and Territorial Fragmentation in Syria, Assessing the Humanitarian and Political Challenges. My name is Radwan Ziadeh. I'm the Senior Fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C., and I'm very pleased to be with you to chair this morning events. As you know, last month, the Security Council passed again a Security Council resolution to allow the cross-border operation, which can help millions of Syrians in northern part of Syria for humanitarian assistance. We are delighted this morning to host His Excellency Abdurrahman Mustafa, the Prime Minister of Syrian Interim Government, who's been in his office since 2020, for his opening keynote conversation about the current political and humanitarian situation in Syria. Just in general background, Syria now almost de facto divided into three different parts. The vast majority of the Syrian territory under the government of the Syrian regime, Bashar al-Assad. In the northern part of Syria, controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces, majority Kurdish group supported by the United States government, and in the northern part of Syria, especially in the suburb of Aleppo, and in the borders between Syria and Turkey, it's governed by Syrian opposition and groups supported by Turkey. And this territory governed by what's called the interim government, which now head by Mr. Abdurrahman Mustafa, who has the pleasure to join us today to speak about his challenges and the situation of the northern part of Syria. Also, we are pleased to have distinguished group of academics and practitioners who will dive deeper into this discussion following the keynote remarks. Just remind everyone, please, if you join us today, because His Excellency Mr. Abdurrahman Mustafa will speak in Arabic. Please go into interpretation and click into English option. Now we'll give Mr. Mustafa 10 to 12 minutes for his opening remarks.
نعم دكتور رضوان، شكرا جزيلا. في البداية أشكر المركز العربي واشنطن والدكتور رضوان الزيادة لإتاحتهم الفرصة لي في هذه الندوة للتكلم عن الحكومة والتجزئة الإقليمية في سوريا. السيدات والسادة الكرام، تحية طيبة. على مدار أكثر من 11 عاما عاشت سوريا خلالها أسوأ الظروف وأشدها مأساوية عبر تاريخها الحديث والمعاصر، حيث انتهك نظام الأسد المجرم كل القيم الإنسانية، وارتكب وبدعم من حلفائه الروس والإيرانيين والميليشيات الإرهابية أفظع المجازر، وتم تهجير السكان وتدمير البلاد واعتقال المدنيين وتعذيبهم حتى الموت. ورغم كل ظروف القهر والظلم والحرمان التي مرت على البلاد وضعف الموارد والإمكانيات، فقد سعت الحكومة السورية المؤقتة بكل ما أتيح لها من وسائل لتخفيف معاناة الناس في كافة القطاعات الخدمية والطبية والتعليمية والإنسانية وغيرها. مثلا في المجال الصحي قمنا وبالتعاون مع صندوق الائتمان لإعادة إعمار سوريا بإنشاء وترميم بعض المشافي والمستوصفات وإنشاء منظومة للإسعاف، كما تم تجهيز العديد من العيادات المتنقلة بين القرى والمخيمات، واستطعنا اتخاذ التدابير الوقائية والعلاجية اللازمة من أجل التصدي لجائحة كورونا، كتأمين مراكز الحجر واللقاحات والأدوية اللازمة وتوعية الناس إلى ضرورة اتخاذ تدابير السلامة. أما في المجال التعليمي فقد استطعنا إنشاء جامعة حلب كصرح علمي هام ورفدها بالكوادر الأكاديمية من مختلف التخصصات، ومن ثم تأمين الاحتياجات اللازمة لها وتجهيزها بالمختبرات. وقد تم تخريج العديد من الدفعات من مختلف التخصصات العلمية، كما قمنا ببناء وترميم المدارس في العديد من مناطق الشمال السوري وتأمين احتياجاتها. وفي المجال الخدمي استطعنا بالتعاون مع الحكومة التركية استجرار الكهرباء الدائمة لجميع مناطق الشمال السوري، كما تم تعبيد وإصلاح شبكات الطرق الرئيسية بين مختلف المناطق، والمساهمة مع المجالس المحلية في حفر الآبار وتأمين مضخات المياه ومد شبكات المياه والصرف الصحي إلى معظم مناطق الشمال السوري. وفي المجال الزراعي نظرا ولكون المنطقة ذات طبيعة زراعية، فقد قامت الحكومة بمساعدة ودعم المزارعين في بعض المستلزمات والمعدات الزراعية وإنشاء مراكز التخزين، كما تم بالتعاون مع صندوق التنمية لإعادة إعمار سوريا تنفيذ بعض المشاريع الزراعية الحيوية لدعم الأمن الغذائي كتأمين القمح وإنشاء المطاحن وتوفير الطحين. وفي المجال الصناعي نبذل جهودا كبيرة لتنمية القطاع الصناعي والتجاري عبر تشجيع الصناعيين على افتتاح منشآتهم وتقديم التسهيلات لهم ضمن مناطق صناعية وتجهيزها بالخدمات والموارد الأساسية، وكذلك أحداث غرف التجارة ودعمها وتأمين احتياجاتها، وقد انعكس ذلك إيجابيا على تحسين الواقع الاقتصادي والخدمي وتخفيض نسب الفقر والبطالة. وتركز الحكومة على تنفيذ المشاريع التي تشكل أولوية في القطاعات الإنسانية والخدمية، ووضع الخطط لتنفيذ المزيد منها ضمن ما يتوفر من إمكانيات وموارد مالية، كما تم اتخاذ خطوات هامة لإنعاش الاقتصاد المحلي كتقديم التسهيلات لاستقطاب رؤوس الأموال وتشجيع التجار. وما زالت المنطقة تحتاج إلى دعم متزايد لتفعيل دور أكبر للصناعة في المنطقة وتصريف المنتجات، مما يؤدي إلى تحسين الواقع الاقتصادي. أما في مجال الإدارة فقد قمنا بتطوير عمل الإدارة العامة وهيئات الحكم المحلي وفقا لمعايير الحوكمة والمبادئ القانونية الناظمة لعمل الإدارة المحلية في سوريا، حيث تنظم أحكام انتخابات المجالس ومدة ولايتها وأجهزتها وهياكلها وآلية عملها وعدد أعضائها، إضافة إلى بناء القدرات للكوادر الإدارية وزيادة كفاءاتها كي تكون قادرة على تأدية المهام والمسؤوليات الملقاة على عاتقها بمهنية وفعالية. وأما على الصعيد الأمني فتتعرض مناطق الشمال السوري لتهديدات أمنية من مصادر مختلفة تتمثل في النظام وحلفائه وتنظيم الPYD والPKK وداعش الإرهابيين لضرب جهود تحقيق الأمن والاستقرار وأي محاولة للبناء والتنمية. ومع ذلك استطاعت الحكومة المؤقتة من تحقيق نجاح ملحوظ في ضبط الوضع الأمني والحد من وقوع اختراقات أمنية عبر ضبط وإحباط العديد من المحاولات الإرهابية قبل وقوعها، وهو ما يظهر من خلال انخفاض معدل الهجمات الإرهابية إلى درجة كبيرة في الآونة الأخيرة. ومن الجدير ذكره في هذا السياق أن الإعفاءات الأخيرة من مفاعيل قانون قيصر ستصب في خدمة التنمية ومواجهة المصاعب الاقتصادية في الشمال السوري بكل تأكيد، لكن الإعفاءات لم تشمل في ذات الوقت مناطق واسعة كمنطقة عفرين، بما يؤدي لاستمرار العديد من الصعوبات والتحديات. ولا بد لي أن أشيد بالدور الذي تبذله الحكومة التركية في محاولتها المساهمة للنهوض بواقع المنطقة وتقديم الدعم الإنساني للسكان. إن عدم الاهتمام الدولي بمعاناة الشعب السوري قد أعطى الفرصة للنظام وحليفيه الروسي والإيراني للتمادي وارتكاب المزيد من الجرائم والانتهاكات، فلو تم تطبيق القرارات الدولية التي تنص على تحقيق الانتقال السياسي في البلاد لكانت معاناة السوريين قد انتهت منذ زمن طويل. لقد شاهد العالم بعضا مما يتعرض له المعتقلون من خلال صور قيصر والمقطع المسرب لمجزرة التضامن، ولذلك فإننا نؤكد على ضرورة إنشاء آلية دولية للكشف عن مصير المعتقلين والمختفين قسريا وتفويضها بالصلاحيات اللازمة لتنفيذ مقرراتها. كما يجب عدم السماح بتحويل ملف المساعدات الإنسانية إلى ورقة للمساومة والابتزاز من قبل أي طرف كان، ولكن ذلك يتطلب توفر الإرادة لدى المجتمع الدولي للاستمرار في إدخال المساعدات إلى سوريا عبر المعابر الحدودية دون قيود أو شروط، احتراما للمبادئ التي يتضمنها القانون الدولي الإنساني من جهة، وما أصدره مجلس الأمن من قرارات في التجارب الدولية. انطلاقا مما تقدم، يجب على المجتمع الدولي أن يتخذ موقفا حازما لإنهاء مأساة الشعب السوري التي أصبحت تشكل تهديدا للأمن والسلم الدوليين نتيجة لممارسات النظام وحلفائه، ولن يتحقق ذلك إلا بتطبيق المقررات الدولية التي تؤدي إلى تحقيق الانتقال السياسي في البلاد استنادا للقرار 2254 وبيان جنيف لعام 2015. كما يقتضي ذلك أيضا إنشاء محكمة جنائية خاصة لمحاسبة النظام المجرم وحلفائه عن كافة جرائم الحرب والإبادة والجرائم ضد الإنسانية التي ارتكبوها بحق الشعب السوري. شكرا لإصغائكم، وأنا جاهز لأي استفسارات، أو حاولت أن أختصر الطرف لأنه كل بند منه بده نقاشات طويلة على ما أعتقد. نحن تقيدنا بالشيء اللي تفضل فيه الدكتور زيادة، ونحن جاهزين لأي استفسارات أو توضيح لأي شيء يتعلق في الملف السوري. شكرا.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mr. Abdurrahman. It was very precise and informative speech. You highlighted the key success stories of the Syrian interim government over the last 5 years, especially combating COVID. The Syrian interim government cooperate with WHO, which played a critical role distributing vaccine, and everyone expected a medical crisis over the crowded in the refugee camps, but the Syrian interim government played a critical role in distributing vaccine. And the second success story, I believe that which you emphasized on education. The Idlbi University now, hundreds of students who don't have access to education before they graduated from Idlbi University and other schools. Of course, as you mentioned, the key challenges, of course, still the security. The area controlled by the Syrian interim government still bombarded, shelled by the Syrian regime or the Russian airplanes. We hear every day stories of tragedies of families has been wiped out or killed by the Russian or the Syrian regime airplanes, with that put more challenge. I have 2 questions to you, Mr. Abdurrahman. My first question was focused on the role of the United States. You been here in Washington last month. As I understood, was very productive conversation with the State Department, National Security, and the focus was how to get the Syrian interim government get advantage of the investment that the U.S. can in the northern part of Syria. Can you tell us more about what you expect from the United States to do in the northern part of Syria, especially with all the division between the Syrian interim government and the Syrian Democratic Forces, a group supported by the United States?
مثل ما تفضلت دكتور رضوان، كان في عندنا زيارة للولايات المتحدة الأمريكية كانت مبرمجة مسبقا، وكان في عندنا الهدف من الزيارة أول شيء أنه بحيث أنه نفهم موضوع الاستثناءات اللي حصلت أو القرار اللي بخصوص قانون قيصر. والزيارة كان هدف الثاني اللقاء مع الجالية السورية ورجال الأعمال السوريين بخصوص الاستثمارات اللي عم تواجه الاستثمارات والوضع الاقتصادي في المناطق المحررة. مثل ما بتعرفوا حاليا بعد جائحة كورونا صار في أزمة عالمية، أزمة اقتصادية عالمية، طبعا عم تكون انعكاساتها سلبية بشكل أكبر للمناطق المحررة نتيجة قلة الموارد والمستثمرين عدم وجود المستثمرين الكبار بحجة أنه الاستقرار الأمني غير متوفر، القوانين الاستثمار غير موجودة. طبعا نحن كان في عندنا صار لنا فرصة أنه كانت هي زيارة رسمية للولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. مثل ما بتعرفوا نحن علاقة المعارضة مع الولايات المتحدة إن حلفاء لنا من بداية الثورة لحتى الآن، إن داعمينا في المسار السياسي وفي المسار الإنساني وبكل المجالات، بحيث طبعا الدعم للمشاريع، بعض المشاريع نحن قدمنا للإدارة الأمريكية بحيث يكون أنه دعمها بشكل مباشر من خلال الحكومة السورية المؤقتة. وطبعا بالنسبة لمشروع التعافي المبكر أنه بحيث أنه تستفيد الحكومة السورية المؤقتة أو المناطق المحررة من القانون. وكانت برأيي أنه كان زيارة إيجابية إلى جوانب إيجابية جدا. ومن الناحية السياسية طبعا كمان تطرقنا على الجانب السياسي على موضوع اللجنة الدستورية وعرقلة النظام وحلفائه للحل السياسي في سوريا، أنه دائما ما في أي تغيير بالنسبة لموقف النظام والحلفاء أنهم بيعتقدوا لحتى الآن أنه هو الحل بسوريا هو حل عسكري وإعادة تعويم النظام دوليا من مقابل حول طروحات من المبعوث الدولي، يعني مثل الطرح اللي طرحه المبعوث الدولي بخصوص الخطوة مقابل خطوة. شرحنا كل هالمواضيع، هذا وجهة نظر الحكومة السورية المؤقتة والمعارضة بهذه الجوانب كلياتها. طبعا بذلك الفترة كان عم نقدم على نهاية فترة إدخال المساعدات عبر الحدود لسوريا، وشرحنا عواقب إذا تم رفض إدخال المساعدات أو عدم الاستمرارية بإدخال المساعدات وانعكاسات المأساوية من الناحية الإنسانية لحوالي 5 مليون سوري، مواطن سوري، إنه بحاجة للدعم الإنساني في المناطق اللي تحت إدارة الحكومة السورية المؤقتة يعني بشكل عام. والعلاقات ومشكلة الإرهاب طبعا هي كانت دائما مطروحة بكل لقاءاتنا مع أصدقائنا الأمريكان. إرهاب القاعدة، إرهاب داعش، إرهاب الKKK، كل المنظمات اللي مصنفة هذول اللي عم بيؤدوا إلى عدم الاستقرار في المنطقة وعم بيعطوا مماسك أو ورقة بيد النظام والروس إنه هي المنطقة الشمال السوري كلياتهم إرهابيين، علما أنه الحكومة السورية المؤقتة هي الذراع التنفيذي للائتلاف الوطني لقوى الثورة والمعارضة اللي معترفة إلى شرعية من دول عديدة. لكن نحن حتى التعامل مع المنطقة لازم يكون ما فيها استثناءات. مثلا عفرين هو القرار الإعفاء اللي طلع من الإدارة الأمريكية بخصوص قانون قيصر هي مفيدة جدا للمنطقة، لكن ما لازم يكون فيها استثناءات، لأنه عفرين هي سورية، يعني ما لازم يتسيس الموضوع بهذا الشكل، لأنه في حوالي 400 ألف مهجر من باقي المناطق السورية لمناطقنا، في خاصة في منطقة عمليات غصن زيتون وعفرين. هذول كمان بحاجة للمساعدات. هذول المواطنين السوريين ما لازم نحن لموقف سياسي لسبب ما نستثنيهم. طبعا نحن طرحنا كل هالمواضيع أثناء لقاءاتنا في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. كان في عندنا عدة لقاءات مع الجالية السورية وكانت مفيدة جدا، ودعينا المستثمرين والسوريين اللي موجودين في أمريكا للاستثمار في الشمال السوري، وأبدينا استعدادنا لدعم كل ما يتطلبه الاستثمار من ناحية الأمن والاستقرار الأمني، من ناحية سن القوانين لحماية المستثمر وممتلكاته، لأنه أصبح المنطقة مهيئة للاستثمار والاستفادة من الإعفاءات اللي حصلت بقانون السيزر.
Thank you, thank you. My next question, since Syria, as I said in the beginning, it's been divided into three types of governance. The Syrian always, they would like to make a comparison between the three different living condition or the cost of living under these three different areas were controlled by different type of governance. Um, in After COVID, we have economic crisis, global economic crisis, but that's hit the Syrian economy maybe in the extreme way. If you look into the UN report, 92% of Syrian under the poverty line. And as you mentioned in your speech, the key role of the Syrian interim governments to improve the condition and the life of the Syrians who live under in the Syrian interim territory. What's your overall plan or future for the future of the Syrians who are living there? Especially, we hear from the news every day tens of Syrians trying to cross from the areas controlled by the government into the areas controlled by the opposition, because the condition or the cost of living is much easier. Can you tell us a little bit about the economic condition and the situation in the northern part of Syria?
نعم، شكرا دكتور زياد. طبعا في الواقع يعني نحن كحكومة سورية مؤقتة الهدف طبعا خدمة المهجرين والمواطنين الموجودين اللي تحت إدارة الحكومة المؤقتة. طبعا في لنا مهمة ثانية أنه نحن مطالبين بأنه نبني سوريا المستقبل، مو فقط المناطق المحررة. هذا كمان فرصة بالنسبة لنا أنه نعمل منطقة نموذجية لسوريا المستقبل، لكل سوريا طبعا. مثل ما تفضلت حاليا انه هن ثلاث اجزاء، انا بعتقد هو اربعه، يعني النظام وفي سلطات الامر الواقع في شمال الشرق وفي شمال الغرب، والحكومه السوريه المؤقته في الشمال السوري. مع انه نحن جهه شرعيه مهمتنا فقط ليس فقط اداره المناطق الحاليه وتقديم الخدمات للمواطنين، وانما جعل المناطق اللي نحن موجودين فيها مناطق نموذجيه لسوريا المستقبل، من حيث بناء الجيش السوري في المستقبل بالنسبه للمركزيه الاداريه بالمجالس المحليه والادارات المدنيه الموجوده بكل السبل: حريه الراي، الحفاظ على حقوق الانسان، الالتزام بالقوانين الدوليه، العدل. في عندنا مهمه بيختلف عن مهمه السلطات الامر الواقع، يعني مهمه اخرى. مثل ما بتعرفوا نحن بمناطقنا، بعتقد انا اذا بدنا نقول نحن يكون في عندنا معايير، المعايير كلها متوفره من ناحيه الهجره اللي عم بتصير، انه اللي عم بيحاولوا يدخلوا لمناطقنا من مناطق النظام، وان كان بمناطق قسد للمناطق المحررة، لأنه الوضع أفضل لكن بما أنه نحن في عندنا حرية الإعلام، ما في أي شيء ضوابط، وحرية الرأي وحرية مثلا امبارحة كان في مظاهرات في الباب في عفرين بخصوص القطاع الصحي، قبل كما كان في بخصوص زيادة أسعار أو ارتفاع أسعار الكهرباء. نحن متاح كل شيء في انتقادات، هذا لا يعني أنه المنطقة إدارتها أو الوضع سيء جدا، لكن المناطق الأخرى بما أنه ما في أي شيء إعلامي أو نقل الواقع إلى الخارج، مثل ما بدهم في إمبراطوريات إعلامية لتلميعهم لصورتهم، عم بيبان أنه هي المشاكل كلها في المناطق المحررة علما. لذلك أنا بطرح دائما بنطرح، وأنا بلقائي مع الجالية في أمريكا طلبت أنه يكون في وفود يقوموا بزيارة المنطقة، وحتى نحن نصرح دائما لأصدقائنا الأمريكان والأوروبيين أنه يكون في وفود يزورونا في المناطق المحررة بحيث أنه يشوفوا لنا كمان الوضع. طبعا نحن ما وصلنا للمرحلة ممتازة أو شيء، لكن صار في أسس نبني عليها في حال توفر الإمكانيات والدعم. تعرف الحكومة السورية المؤقتة ما في لها أي دعم نهائيا، فقط بعض المشاريع من صندوق الائتمان لإعادة أعمار سوريا، لا للقطاع الصحي ولا القطاع التعليمي، وإنما هو من خلال منظمة الصحة العالمية بشكل عام، لكن ما هي بشكل عن طريق الحكومة السورية المؤقتة. الواقع في شيء صار من ناحية الإدارة، من ناحية الحوكمة، بناء مؤسسات موجودة، لكن بدها تطوير، لربما بدها إصلاح. في عندنا طبعا تقصير، لكن هذا التقصير ناتج عن قلة الإمكانيات وقلة الدعم الدولي، والموارد مثل ما تعرفوا محدودة جدا موارد الحكومة السورية المؤقتة. وفي تهديد، أنا حتى في الكلمة تطرقت إلى، في تهديد أمني دائما من خارج المناطق، يعني من خارج الجبهات اللي عم بيكون داخل المناطق الآهلة بالسكان المدنيين واستهدافهم بشكل مباشر. طبعا الحكومة السورية المؤقتة عم تتعاون مع كل المنظمات الحقوقية الدولية، على رأسهم لجنة التحقيق الدولية الخاصة بالمستقلة الخاصة بسوريا. نحن دائما متجاوبين لأي استفسار بشكل رسمي، وفي عندنا لقاءات دائما، مثلا عم نعطي دورات، في عندنا بروتوكولات مع منظمات كمان دولية بخصوص القانون الإنساني الدولي وحقوق الإنسان، عم نعطي دورات عناصر الجيش الوطني وقاداتهم، حتى المؤسسات الشرطة العسكرية، مثل منظمة نداء جليف، في عندنا بروتوكول معنا إنه مستمرين. وكمان قبل فترة كمان في عندنا كان بروتوكول مع مركز دراسات الشرق الأوسط أورسم، كمان مهتمين جدا. لكن مثل ما حكيت إنه كل شيء بده إمكانيات يعني.
Thank you very much. I know you have a flight to catch up to Istanbul, but I will get some questions from the floor. The first question from Mr. Bubakar Zaid, who asked you about what's the size of the territory that the Syrian interim government control now, comparing to the overall Syrian territories. And then, of course, what's your long-term plan for Syria in the future?
يعني حوالي بين ال 18 و 20 ألف كيلومتر. طبعا بالنسبة لخطتنا نحن، الخطة هي خطتنا هي اسمها حكومة سوريا المؤقتة. هو نحن بعد ما بيتحقق الانتقال السياسي ويطبق القرار 2254، نحن لازم تكون خطتنا لكامل سوريا. هذا هو الهدف النهائي. لكن حاليا في مهجرين حوالي 4 مليون، وطال أمد الحل السياسي نتيجة عرقلة النظام وحلفائه. لذلك نحن بحاجة لحوكمة وإدارة لهذه المناطق لتقديم الخدمات واكتساب خبرة في المجال الإدارة المدنية وحقوق الإنسان والقانون والعدل، بحيث نطبقها على سوريا المستقبل. هذا هو الخطة النهائية، لأنه نحن حكومة مؤقتة ما بيكون في عنا خطة بعيدة المدى، يعني هي المدى المتوسط القصير والمتوسط. خطتنا دائما هو بناء مؤسسات والاستفادة من الموارد بشكل صحيح واكتساب خبرة في الحوكمة.
Last questions come from Hussein Najjar, which asked about the future of the negotiation with the Syrian regime. We know the Syrian opposition, along with the Syrian regime, engaged in negotiation in Geneva since 2013. It has a different platform, it comes with a different resolution, but it was the overall for the implementation of the Security Council Resolution 2254. What's your take about the future of the Geneva talks?
طبعا نحن كمعارضة سورية دائما خيارنا هو الحل السياسي، انه ما في حل بسوريا غير الحل السياسي. لذلك نحن من 2014 من جنيف 1 الى مؤتمر رياض 1، مؤتمر رياض 2، الجولات اللي انعقدت بجنيف كلها نحن كنا ايجابيين وفرطنا في تطبيق القرار 22 على 54. حتى المسارات الموازية أو الرديفة لمسار جنيف، مثلا نحن دعمنا مسار أستانا. أي شيء يؤدي إلى حل سياسي في سوريا نحن كنا كمعارضة سورية تعاملنا معها بشكل إيجابي. لكن النظام وحلفائه ما عندهم قناعة بالحل السياسي، هن الحل عندهم دائما عسكري. حتى نحن لما نكون الوفد المفاوض باسم المعارضة في جنيف كانوا هن بيرتكبوا مجازر في مناطق مختلفة من سوريا. لذلك هن دائما كانت رسالته واضحة أنه ليسوا مع الحل السياسي في سوريا. والدليل على ذلك ما عم بيكون فيه أي تقدم بأي مسار. يعني مسار اللجنة الدستورية نحن على قناعة أنه المشكلة بسوريا هي ليست الدستور فقط، وإنما في كثير أمور لازم حلها قبل الدستور. لكن الحفاظ على القرار 22/54 حي إنه حي الحل السياسي مستمر تحت سقف الأمم المتحدة. نحن انخرطنا وتعاملنا بشكل جدي بموضوع اللجنة الدستورية، لكن ما في إرادة دولية لا من المجتمع الدولي ولا من الأمم المتحدة للضغط على النظام. طبعا حلفاء النظام صادقين مع النظام، يعني إن كان الإيرانيين إن كانوا الروس ما غيروا من بداية 2015 ومن بداية انطلاق الثورة السورية، كانوا ما غيروا أي شيء بتصرفاتهم أو بدعمهم للنظام. لكن للأسف المجتمع الدولي ما اهتم بالملف السوري وما كانوا جادين بالضغط على النظام أو حلفاء النظام لأنه يتحقق شيء من خلال العملية السياسية ومسارات اللي تم إطلاقها مسار وهي الوحيدة المسار اللجنة الدستورية 8 جولات مثل ما بتعرفوا ما كان فيها أي تطور، ونحن كمان ما كنا بننتظر إنه يكون فيها تطور لأنه نحن نعرف النظام بشكل جيد. وآخر جولة كانت على أساس رفضوا النظام الاشتراك في الجولة التاسعة للأسف النظام بحجة بتعليمات من الروس أو كذا. وهذا يثبت أنه دائما كان بيتهمنا النظام أنه نحن مرتبطين بالدول وعم ننفذ أجندات دولية بشكل واضح اللي تتوضح أنه هن بتعليمات الروس والإيرانيين عم بيتصرفوا. ما عاد في شيء اسمه دولة سورية، صارت نظام مافيات وعصابات فقط بينفذوا أوامر داعمينهم لتنفيذ أجندات غير سورية ما لها علاقة بسوريا، إن كان في أوكرانيا حاليا عرفت ولا في دول ثانية. فقط أداة النظام أداة في يد حلفائه. نحن نتمنى، نحن لحتى الآن مقتنعين بأن ما في حل بسوريا غير الحل بتطبيق القرارات الأممية وعلى رأسهم القرار 22/54. ولا بد من المجتمع الدولي اتخاذ موقف أكثر قوة من تصرفات النظام الروسي. وخاصة يعني الكل كان عم بتوقع أنه الحرب الروسية لأوكرانيا بدها تنعكس إيجابيا على الملف السوري، لأنه الروس ما غيروا، بالعكس عم بتلاقي أنه عم بينعكس سلبا على الملف السوري. ولحتى لما قاطعوا اللجنة الدستورية على الأقل حاليا بعد الحرب على أوكرانيا عم بيحاول يستفيد الروس من خلال الملف السوري في مناطق أخرى، نزاعات في مناطق أخرى. نحن لحتى الآن نؤمن داعمين للعملية السياسية والجهود المبعوث الدولي في بروسل.
Thank you very much, His Excellency Abdurrahman Mustafa. I know you have flight to catch. I will let you go, but I would thank you again for such informative speech, and thank you for answering our question. Now we'll have a panel discussion about the governance in Syria. We are pleased to have three excellent speakers this morning with us. Dr. Rahaf Aldoughli, she's a lecturer in the Middle East and North African Studies at Lancaster University. And we have Qutaiba Idlbi, who's right now a fellow at the International Center for Transitional Justice. And with us also Dima Moussa. She's a Syrian American lawyer and member of the Syrian National Coalition. Each one of the speaker will give 5 to 7 minutes remarks. After that, we will have a discussion, and also we will have a discussion from the floor. If you have any question, please type your question on Q&A. And now I will give the floor to start with the Dima, which will cover the United States role which will cover more the Syrian perspective on ongoing humanitarian crisis in Syria. The Syrian conflict right now, it's a true definition of what we call a freezing conflict. That's because it transfers since 2015 after the Russian intervention in Syria in September 2015 to be more a global conflict. Since 2019, the global power, especially the United States and Russia, decided that's the best alternative to the conflict in Syria to keep the freeze and to decrease number of violence and to freeze the territories as it is right now. And now we enter a new phase in the Syrian conflict, which became a freezing conflict. And of course, when we talk about freezing conflict, there's many freezing conflicts around the world, and the most famous one, of course, in Cyprus, in northern part of Cyprus, and the Turkish the other part of Cyprus controlled by the Turkish minority there. But before we comparing to other freezing conflicts around the world, we'll hear from different perspectives. The Syrian perspective about the impact of the conflict in Syria right now. Dima?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the Arab Center for organizing this important discussion and inviting me to join the other distinguished guests, Dr. Rahaf Aldoughli and my colleague Qutaiba Idlbi. When I saw the title of today's event, I had to stare at it for a little bit. When we talk about territorial and governance fragmentation, are they really two separate things or one thing? They really do go hand in hand, but it's hard to determine which one comes first, especially within the Syrian context. The same thing goes with political and humanitarian challenges, which brings to mind one of my favorite quotations, which is that humanitarian crises don't have humanitarian solutions. Today, Syria is at its highest level of fragmentation, which is increasing as time goes by, in the sense that lines along which the country is divided today are getting deeper and perpetuated or exasperated by political challenges, which I will return to in a little bit. The fragmentation that we're talking about in Syria is exhibited in all aspects, the three main ones of which are political, economic, and social. These are probably the more obvious ones, but they do have an effect on all aspects of life in Syria. These, to a certain extent, had their roots prior to 2011 in Syria and took a slightly different shape post-2011, where they were in constant change as the territorial areas of influence changed. Today, the territorial fragmentation has been somewhat fixed for the past 2+ years, since major military operations in their previous form ended after the Sochi Agreement on March 5th, 2020. This is not to say that there are no positive aspects to ending the phase of major military operations. as that greatly reduced civilian casualties and major displacement movement. However, with the political process, as Dr. Radwan and as my colleague, Mr. Abdurrahman, has said, the political process being frozen and being governed by several factors that prolong reaching political settlement, the country's division is becoming deeper, and the territorial fragmentation is getting translated into deeper divisions in the aforementioned aspects that I talked about. This is adding additional obstacles that we will have to deal with and overcome with the political solution. So the longer and the deeper this fragmentation becomes, the more that we have to take care of when we actually get to the point of a political solution. And it makes it more crucial than ever to have a comprehensive political solution through the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2254. Now, if we go back to the factors that are prolonging the reaching a political settlement, these include not having a willing, serious partner at the table, that being the regime side, which has shown time and again that it's not serious about reaching a political solution. And I don't think this is surprising to anyone that has been following Syria for the last 10 years. And it is consistent with the way the regime has acted since negotiations first started. The last example of which the talks in Geneva in the format of the Constitutional Committee. I'm actually a member of that group that has met 8 times in Geneva. And the last time the regime used the excuse of the Russians having problems getting visas to Switzerland as an excuse to pull out of these talks. The other factor is the role of the international community, in particular, the international players involved in the Syria file, as they have conflicting interests in Syria. This file at all levels is subject to these conflicting interests, as well as the tensions between the players, even when it's not directly related to Syria, which we have seen more clearly than ever over the last 5 months since the Ukraine crisis has started. And these differences and disagreements between especially between the US and Russia are the ones that had the most adverse effect on the Syria file. And for several years, the humanitarian file has been one of the main casualties of this conflict and these differences. And the last example of which we saw a few weeks ago, when the resolution for cross-border aid was up for extension, and we saw the difficulty in achieving that. And every year we go through this. If we look at the humanitarian situation in the areas outside the regime control, and the humanitarian situation also being affected by this fragmentation, this has also been the subject to changing policies of the countries providing the humanitarian support in the different areas. The needs are becoming greater as time goes by, yet the support is not increasing. Quite the contrary. In some cases, it's decreasing. It's becoming more restricted, reaching fewer beneficiaries, and getting increasingly politicized and subject to the political disagreements, especially between the US and Russia. 2254, I want to go back a little bit to the resolution. It has humanitarian aspects that are supposed to build trust between the Syrian sides and among Syrians in order to create the appropriate environment in which the political solution can be implemented and sustained. And I think today the humanitarian file requires work that gives Syrians faith in the international system as a whole, as they see their humanitarian needs used as a way for countries to get back at each other for issues not entirely related to the Syria file. In this sense, Syria has put to test the international community's commitment to empower the UN to achieve its central mission, maintaining international peace and security, and also put to test the international communities, but more specifically major powers like the US and Russia, that they can truly work together to have positive role in resolving such conflicts instead of using them as additional battlegrounds to get back at each other. But unfortunately, what we are witnessing today is a failure of those tests. With this deadlock before us as opposition, we are required to think outside the box, as we can't just sit around and wait for the international players to figure out their disagreements that have become a major additional obstacle to an already complex Syria file. And since the comprehensive solution is put on the back burner, I don't like to say it's frozen or complete deadlock, because as somebody who works in politics, we always have to look for opportunities to move things. But so that means we as opposition, we need to continue working. We need to make sure that at least the areas under the opposition do not contribute to perpetuating the fragmentation. And while at the same time ensuring that Syrians living there get their basic livelihood needs fulfilled. And I think this is something that Mr. Abdurrahman touched on, but especially in economic, health, and education. So naturally humanitarian issues as well. And this means for us, we need to start looking, while we wait for the full and comprehensive solution, to start working on partial and local solutions, including improvements in the areas outside the regime control. And as somebody mentioned, today, those areas, there are actually 3 areas. There is the area under the opposition control, there is the Northwest and the Northeast. All of these areas, they are opposed to the regime. They're not necessarily all on the same page. They need to be somehow bridged and in preparation for the political solution. There are a lot of issues to take care of in terms of bridging these areas, trying to find commonalities, trying to get rid of any of the obstacles that are standing in the way of making these areas a better example or a better prepared to go towards the full political solution. And maybe this sounds a little bit, or at least to us, this is something that what we envision when we talk about when there's talk about the step-for-step, which I think a lot of you have talked about. Of course, there were no details given by those who are proposing it, but step-for-step is actually a tool to go forward in the political process. The way we envision it is that there are steps and there are things that we can do to contribute to the full political solution, to the full implementation of 2254. We know what the regime would envision the step-for-step to be, things that would benefit the regime side. And actually, to be honest, we also know that what some international players might want from step-for-step outside the context of a political solution, because it would better serve their interests. So what we need to be working on is, I think it's very important today, and to go back to the title of today's event, is to start working locally where we can work, partially also where we can work to ensure that we can maybe mitigate some of the effects of this de facto division that we are experiencing today, to ensure it doesn't get any deeper, and perhaps, you know, do things that prepare us to go into the political solution, make it much easier to reunite Syria, and people can go back to where they came from. And also we can truly transition Syria to the next phase that we all had in mind when the popular movement and protests took to the streets in 2011. I'm sorry, I thought I had 10 minutes. I can have more to say, but maybe during the Q&A there could be more to be said. Thank you, Radwan.
Thank you, Dima. I have a few questions to you, but I will keep my question to the end. Now we will move to Qutaiba to give his opening remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Radwan. Thank you for the Arab Center for the invitation on this important topic. I think building on what Dima mentioned, we are in a the de facto status now of having 4 Syrias. The issue of governance is really at importance here because of the political blockage we're seeing in Geneva and elsewhere. And why this is important, because the battle today, in Syria on, creating the future Syria or building a future Syria state is happening on governance level. The competition today between, us as whether it is opposition or other groups who are working to advance the Syrian dream in freedom and democracy, we are in a competition level, mainly with the Assad regime, on who's providing, a sense of future for the Syrian people, because that would decide who's having leverage today on the ground as the political negotiations on the table are frozen. And that's why this is very important, because whoever is, able to provide more services to Syrians, whoever is able to attract more of the Syrian population, whether willingly through, development, through job opportunities, or unwillingly through deals with regional countries, through, forcing refugees back into the country, whoever is able to do more of that will have more leverage on the negotiations table, especially with the international community, to say, I'm the one who is handling the majority of the Syrian population. And as such, I'm the one who needs most of the support, most of the reconstruction support, most of the political and economic development support. To focus specifically on the US role, kind of like in driving governance on the ground, the issue we are facing today in Washington is two things. On one hand, the United States approach to the region, and specifically to Syria today, is providing so-called regional solutions to regional problems. And Syria is seen as a regional problem. The issue is that the regional solution, in the eyes of those who are making decisions in Washington today, is that Russia and Iran are the regional actors who can provide that solution in Syria, which means pushing, as much as softly but surely, pushing areas outside the control of the Assad regime back into its control, and kind of like containing the problem in Syria with the Assad regime that can provide at least short-term stability in the eyes of decision makers in Washington. So that translates into not providing a political strategy for the actors, specifically in political strategy for the three areas of control in northern Syria, which could provide a lot of leverage to force Iran, Russia, and the Assad regime back into the negotiations table. The other problem with the US strategy right now in the region, specifically on Syria, is that unfortunately that area of leverage in northern Syria is being used as the punching bag of the disagreement between the United States and Turkey today. Instead of working on collaboration that can utilize that leverage in northern Syria for the betterment of the Syrian people, for their cause in freedom and democracy, for providing some stability for the millions of Syrians in northern Syria, there is lack of as far as I know, any serious talk between the United States and Turkey on how can we actually leverage this area against Iran, Russia, and the regime. And as a result, we see further displacement in northern Syria. We see, as Dima mentioned, a reduction in humanitarian support, reduction in stabilization support for governance, and not actually providing, even for those that the United States call partners on the ground. There is no strategic vision for what this partnership actually entails. What would northeastern Syria would look like in 10 years? At least in northern and northwestern Syria, I mean, there is this atmosphere. There is some work on providing or working on creating a model for talks about what model of future governance would look like. But the problem is the areas where the US is invested the most is the ones actually lacking this strategic vision and how they would integrate with the rest of northern Syria. As the problem with this strategy for Syria today from Washington is that it is pushing regional actors and actors involved on the ground, whether those who are able to support stronger governing model for northern Syria, or those who can actually manipulate differences on the ground. It is pushing those actors who are able to support to actually take a step back, because they see that the United States with its political investments, with its economic and aid investments actually drawing back. And it is pushing actors like Iran, Russia, to actually invest more in creating differences in northern Syria, and actually destabilizing the region through direct attacks, through allowing sleeper cells for terrorist groups, ISIS and otherwise, to operate across northern Syria, in the hopes of creating more differences to be able to control those areas in the future. So the only way on the short term to address this issue is, I believe we cannot run away from the elephant in the room, which is that Turkey and the United States need to sit on the table and actually figure out a solution for, unfortunately, the children of this divorce between the United States and Turkey, who are the Syrian people today.
Thank you. Thank you, Qutaiba. Now we'll come more into perspective on the situation of the governance on the ground with Rahaf. Rahaf, please go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Radwan. Thank you very much for this invitation. I really enjoyed listening to Dima and Qutaiba, and I do agree with most of the points that were mentioned, especially with the practical and rational approach towards how to end the war in Syria. I might sound a little bit more critical or vocal than complacent with what Mr. Abdurrahman mentioned today. I have perhaps I would start with my talk about how, this is how I have titled my speech, is about breaking the bottleneck in the Syrian civil war and maybe prospects for future reconciliations in Syria. I mean, we do all know that what we are talking about today is kind of approaches or prospects for reconciliations. We do know that we are in that there is a conflict trap, or we have lack of, maybe perhaps all of us Syrians, lack of a contextual and critical contextualization of the terms used, or what is allies, friends, or enemies here. I would totally agree with what Qutaiba, how Qutaiba ended his talk with, that Turkey and the US is being divorced, and we are and I think this is a very important metaphor that kind of summarizes where we are now. And that, like, honestly, we are, as more, or practically speaking, Syrians from all political ideological factions or belonging to different ideological sectarian and or maybe religious factions, we are more of used bones, instruments, tools by these regional actors and even the US. So I will start with a very, like, a kind of a very, I've written this before, it's still now under the process of being written, which is a kind of policy report about how to end the civil war. Like, seemingly I'm trying to think loudly with you about, first of all, I'll start. I think one of the problems is that we started with what we are where we are now, is the problem with identifying, is it a war, is it a revolution, or is it what is it, or is it a popular uprising? So of course, with all of this, I mean, we have different we can have different approaches of how to identify what we are, where we are now, but perhaps one of, like, the most important thing I think here is to know that the Syrian war is not an exception. We have many examples in history where that there are conflicts in around the world that were trapped and actually where they have lasted or become quagmire for other regional and international actors. So we are more of exceptional in the violence that were used by the regime against civilians in Syria, but at the same time, there are other examples that we can learn from. I would start with that. There are three kinds of civil wars that lasted, or start three waves of new civil wars, as Barbara Walters defined, and those who are that emerged after World War II, and then the second phase were after the Cold War, and then what we have now is the new civil wars. I think one of the problem is that when we have these kinds of these wars, it's most likely that the militants or the militias on the ground resist negotiated settlements. And I think here what we are here, and even drawing from what Mr. Abdurrahman was talking about, is that where we are now is that we are in a frozen political conflicts, and we all agree that we have a kind of no political will from any actor to solve this, and especially that the war in Syria has descended into a zero-sum conflict where all of the actors involved in this, their security is more important than their interests. So they act in a way that they don't have much benefits as much as more of securitizing other actors on the ground. So where become violence more widespread. So I would think of two. Let me just, so we need to build a strategic landscape and map out a reconciliation and resolution process based on two interrelated yet conceptually distinctive approaches, a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach, with the entrenched and complex nature of the Syrian conflict that suggests neither decisive military victory for any party nor a quick or immediate resolution to the social, political, sectarian, or ideological divisions. So I argue that establishing a lasting or a comprehensive or even a partial peace requires a rational and long-term process where novel meanings and conceptions of democracy are introduced at a gradual and grassroots level. Endorsing this kind of long-term vision is supported by cases where foreign invasions claiming to bring democracy by a Western power, such as that of Iraq or Libya, which have proved to contribute to more chaos and sectarian divisions than anything else. I think one of the most, when I talk about the top-down approach, is more or less of that changing or updating, reviving our narrative towards the international community. What do we need, or what are we asking the international community to do for us? I think to end the Syrian regime or to enforce the implementation of 2254 is quite difficult with the presence of Russia and Iran, and even with Turkey willingly able to sign a deal with the regime if their security concerns in northeast Syria is kind of maintained. So what we are in front of today is managing the conflict or maintaining the status quo rather than any kind of active implementation of any political process. Also, our even approach towards the conflict become more of a impulsive reaction rather than taking action. So I think that the kind of the change of narrative that I'm talking about here is, and as other civil wars contexts where a strong regional actors that kind of implement and impose a peace deal from above, where the four actors kind of contain each of them contain their militias where they dominate in a way that to stop violence for 5 or 7 years. Within this testing this kind of peace deal for 5-7 years here, I think it's important to have a bottom-up approach where different Syrian communities from different backgrounds start to have access to these different areas rather than being divided. And I think there is another point that we lack, we don't talk a lot about, which is the ideological impact of the Ba'ath regime over the last 5 decades on Syrians. We often talk about how to end the Syrian conflict in a military sense, but we don't talk much about how to deal with the different Syrian communities that's in regime-controlled areas. I think it's time to find common ground in terms of narrative and rhetoric with all Syrians. And I think there is one potential point of common ground for Syrians, which can be found with the rejection of foreign meddling. For example, close followings of loyalists and even the official page of the Syrian Arab Republic, you find kind of instance that they agree where interventions by regional and international powers during the war have largely served to advance those foreign countries rather than the interests of Syrians. So I think there are certain common grounds that you can find among all Syrians. Another point is the Caesar Syrian Civilian Protection Act, or the sanctions, which are widely viewed in Syria as being equally harmful to the opposition's efforts as they are to Assad's. Of course, we know that there are many academic and policy analysts which have questioned the benefits of sanctions in overthrowing authoritarian regimes or even changing regime behavior. Moreover, sanctions have also stripped Syrians of their agency, as they have become part of the broader dispute between the US and Russia, turning the Caesar Act into leverage used by great powers to further their own interests as a political tool in the hands of Syrians. So therefore, Syrians in the diaspora should offer help through civil organizations to and the West and the UN should facilitate such communal networks. This will help to construct more of an inclusive national narrative, one that goes beyond with or against, and create a sense that Syrians are all one in this. Moreover, effective steps can be taken by Syrian lobbying groups in the West, where steps to alleviate economic sanctions must only be made if mechanisms to ensure the safe return of refugees and allow local civil society organizations to distribute aid and aid are implemented first. Another thing that I want to talk about is the reconstruction of Syria can benefit from the safe return of refugees and the diaspora populations and the empowerment of the younger generations. And I think most of Syrians, especially when you see on social media, and I don't want to generalize here, that there is a sense of apathy and indifference towards political participation. And I think most Syrians are now neither full-heartedly agree with the opposition or see the opposition as legitimate and representative of them, neither, and also at the same time they don't see the regime that represents them. So I think there is a more of in between, and the gray area have come back forward. I'm not saying that people are not with the revolution or with the uprising, but there is a sense of tiredness. There is a sense of political fatigue towards what's happening. And I think there is many steps, like, as I said, the top down, the bottom up approach, where we can find, which can be facilitated through a common ground narratives. And my last point is many individuals civil groups and policymakers we should also think of how to benefit from the emergence of a new generation of Syrians over the decade-long conflict. Many such individuals today have little allegiance to either the Assad regime or opposition militias. As such, they are well situated to establish connections with Syrians inside the country and to help depolarize and depoliticize the narrative. It's vital to challenge the knee-jerk authoritarian assumption that differences in political views are grounded in conflicts between different communities, identities, sects, and patronage network. This can be done by ensuring that reconstruction does not exclude any group or pit one sect or ethnicity against the other. We know from prior experiences with democratization that its success depends on the establishment of a new form of political culture and active citizenry. Therefore, I think the process of reconciliation and conflict reduction should begin with Syrians looking inward and assessing their country's own civic conditions, rather than assuming that external agencies or strong men can step in and rescue us from the destructive legacies of the war. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Rahaf. Thank you, everyone, for its amazing remarks. I will start addressing some questions to the panelists before taking any questions from Q&A. And please, if you have any question, just put it on Q&A, and I will address it to the panelists here. My first question to Qutaiba, which focus more on the US foreign policy towards Syria. Since 2020, when Biden administration came into the White House, their priority in Syria was clear: focus the attention on the humanitarian crisis. And this is why they succeed in a way to pass two Security Council resolution 2585, which allowed for the continuance of the cross-border operation. They did not get what they want. They want actually a long-term solution They want to add more cross borders, not only Bab al Hawa, also Bab al Salam and others, but at least they be able to pass through and maneuver the Russian veto twice. But the US administration also silent on any efforts or any investment or even any political capital in the political situation in Syria. And I think now 2 years from Biden administration, this is the case exactly. Focus more on humanitarian, deal with the Syrian conflict as a frozen conflict, as I mentioned that many times, and look if there is any change coming up from the ground. This is why the United States oppose any military operation by Turkey or by Russia or by the Syrian regime or by Qasad, Syrian Democratic Forces, because their only primary goal is to freeze the conflict and keep the situation as it is. What's your take on that, Qutaiba?
Indeed, I mean, so since the Biden administration came in 2 years ago, I think there were the strategy that was set eventually for Syria is one continue the operation and anti-ISIS operations to ensure continuous defeat of ISIS. And the other two one is like humanitarian aid and human rights. I think 2 years in on working on on Syria so far, the problem is we haven't seen a lot of advancement on those top priorities. In terms of, I think, defeating ISIS, yes, we've seen less territorial control. We've seen more leaders from ISIS being taken out. But we haven't seen really any address for the root issues that cause ISIS to emerge in Syria and cause ISIS to continue to have presence, whether in al-Badia, in Deir ez-Zor, or as a sleeper cells or hideouts in areas of northwest, or operating or getting recruits across all territorial areas. We still, on humanitarian aid, I think we are seeing a setback. Yes, cross-border operations have been renewed for 6 months, but a very critical issue maintained here. We are, giving Russia, especially at this time, control over humanitarian aid going into Syria, going into northern Syria, at a time where Russia does not even contribute $1 single to humanitarian operations in Syria. Not only that, but we're also, on one hand, punishing the Assad regime economically through sanctions, but on the other hand, we are actually providing leverage to the Assad regime by sending aid through Damascus. I'm not saying we should cut all operations, of aid through Damascus or cut the aid to the UN, but there needs to be, if our goals or if the goals of the U.S. administration is really to continue, pressure on the Assad regime, is really to increase the portfolios of humanitarian aid and human rights in Syria. We need to, our policy should be announced or serving those goals. And right now, our policy is not helping more Syrians get more humanitarian aid because we are, on one hand, again, giving a lot of leverage to the Assad regime over aid getting distributed in Damascus. And on the other hand, giving a lot of leverage to Russia over aid getting into northern Syria. On human rights issues, we've seen, at least in 2019 and 2020, hundreds of designations on sanctions, whether on the Caesar sanctions, on other sanction lists for whether those who are contributed to Syria's chemical weapons program, whether those who are contributing to the system of forced disappearance and torture in Syria. But we haven't seen something similar in the 2 years, in the last 2 years from the Biden administration, even though, again, human rights and accountability should constitutes a priority for the Biden administration as it announced. So as long as there is no balanced policy that takes in consideration how some of the US administration policies are actually damaging the political process, how some of those policies are giving, leverage to Assad, to the Assad regime in Russia with nothing in return. As long as those problems are not addressed, we are going to continue to see this contradiction, which is reflecting negatively, whether on the political process itself or on the daily lives of Syrians.
Excellent. Thank you, Qutaiba. Before I address my question to Dima, I think following the discussion and the debate behind the scene of the Security Council Resolution 2642, which passed in July last month, which continued with the security, the assistance through the Bab al-Hawa cross-boarding, it shows that the Syrian regime and Russia both are desperate to have such kind of resolution, not the opposite way. We used to believe that such kind of resolution, it's important to feed millions of the Syrian in the northern part of Syria, which is still true, by the way. But by Russian providing a early draft for 6 months and keeping the money flow to the Syrian regime areas, I think according to the many investigative reports, it shows that the regime benefits almost 300 million every 6 months, $300 million every 6 months from this Security Council resolution. And as you mentioned, Qutaiba, Russia contributed 0 to the humanitarian, and the regime has no any other hard currency. He needs the money anyway to continue operation and to use this money, to use this UN money aid to supply his war against the Syrian people. This is why I think we have to change our approach and not to give the Russia or the Syrian regime any leverage over this Security Council resolution, because it benefits the regime more than the opposition. Even the opposition still need such resolution to allow the UN assistance through northern part of Syria. And that's take me to the question to you, Dima, on the Security Council resolution 2254, which became the Bible of the political solution in Syria. Everyone talk about it, but if we read the text now, 7 years after the passing of Security Council resolution, everyone believe this became a dream or fantasy. It talks about 18 months of election, 18 months of writing new constitutions. Now 7 years after the passing of the Security Council resolution, none of this became tangible, or none of this became reality on the ground. Even the situation became much, much worse politically, economically, and of course, regarding the 3 different territory governance in Syria. It is time for the Syrian opposition to pass by, not talk much on Security Council resolution, and focus more on governing the territorial under the control of the Syrian interim government, which the main goal of such webinar, and find a new strategy to be able to leverage and achieve political solution, rather than depending or focusing on a Security Council resolution. It became part of the past. What do you think, Dima?
Well, I respectfully disagree. I mean, at the end of the day, any resolution, and if you look at, and this is not unique to just Syria, but usually UN resolutions are basically 2254 wasn't written by Syrians. It was written by the international community, and all these resolutions, they always have what is supposed to be constructive ambiguity, because for the most part, these resolutions don't get implemented. We don't want this to happen with this resolution. It has a roadmap of the political solution. So it's not necessarily, we can't read it in the time context, in the historical context in which it was written. I mean, some part of it maybe, because it does talk about areas that are under siege, But at the end of the day, it does cover the roadmap, not just for the political solution, but also for how to build confidence among Syrians, because it touches on the issue of detainees and the issue of the displaced and the missing persons. So we don't need to look at it literally. We need to use it as a guideline. If we don't have it, we don't really have anything else to guide us through the political process. And actually, it also references the Geneva communique, which goes into much more detail about the transitional period. Now, I agree with you. We can't look at also the timelines that are in there in terms of when it was issued, when it was adopted. These timelines are from the point where we actually start the political process, start political transition. Now, this doesn't mean that this is, and I think I tried to relay this point while I was talking, that this doesn't mean that we need to sit around and wait until such time that we can, that the regime comes to the table, that all the major players are not obstructing the process, because we're not asking anybody to give us a solution. I agree in a lot of the things that the Dr. Rahaf actually said, with some, of course, exceptions. But I do agree with a lot of things that at the end of the day, it's Syrians that need to do this. And meanwhile, and this is something I also said, that we need to focus on working on the ground, whether it's through the Syrian interim government, or also through the local efforts, along with the local organizations, Syrians working on the ground, a lot of initiatives on the ground to prepare for such point when that 0 point starts, when that transition, when we actually, it looks more like a reality and we go forward. Of course, the way it's supposed, the order in which this is supposed to happen, once it actually starts getting implemented, is you have a transitional governing body that works on passing through, or putting together a new constitution, and then at the end you have elections based on the new constitution. So I don't think it's obsolete in the sense that it does give you a roadmap. You can look at it, and you don't look at it in the context of the time when it was adopted. You always have to look at it in the context, in the historical, in the current point. Like today, every day I talk or I work towards implementing a political solution. I have to look at it in the environment that I'm working in today, and how I can improve this environment to make it more conducive to actually implementing this political solution. So I think reading it literally, and again, reading it with the eyes of 2015, December 2015, when it was adopted, of course, is not going to make sense. It's going to make it look obsolete. A lot has changed since then, but it still is very relevant in terms of that this actually is a result of an international consensus, which we do need, but it's not enough by itself, of course. And meanwhile, working in terms of the governance, because I think I saw one of the questions in the chat, and I really do want to address this. And in a way, it answers your question. In terms of the governance, we do need to work to address the people's daily needs and to make sure that their livelihoods are improved as much as possible within the resources we have, within the limitations we have, especially due to a lot of the intervention from external actors, whether you have the sanctions or militarily or whatever way they are intervening. But at the same time, our goal is not to create a separate state. Somebody was asking, do you want to establish an independent state in the areas where you're working? No, absolutely not. This is actually the opposite of what we want to be doing. But we can work on governance in a sense that with the political solution as outlined in 2254 and the Geneva communique in our minds. So I absolutely do not agree that it's obsolete, and it's dangerous to go down that road, because we know from experience, whether in the Syria context, I mean, we do have two major resolutions in this sense, 2118 and 2254, and then they came after the Geneva communique, and every time you have a new resolution, you have a lower standard or a lower ceiling or less to work with, because it does take into account the situation today. And we don't want that. We want to take into consideration the situation today when we're working on the implementation. And of course, there are other examples in terms of Security Council resolutions when they put away one resolution and adopt a new one. There are examples with regards to Palestine, for example, and other parts of the world. So I absolutely don't think this is something that we are going to do or that we should do, not just as opposition, but I think as Syrians. This should be our guideline, not to say, though, we cannot work on a lot of the other things that were discussed. And I do like a lot of the ideas that Dr. Rahaf actually talked about, especially with engaging more Syrians, young Syrians, inside Syria and outside.
Thank you, Dima. My last question to Rahaf. In your remarks, you focus much more on the role of the culture in bringing Syrian together, which a key role in understanding the Syrian conflict, because the Syrian conflict is not only a political conflict; it became an armed conflict. Sectarian has a sectarian part of it, and then of course part of it still, of course, the deteriorating of the economic situation. Syria and unfortunately, when we talk in Syria now about the economy of poverty. Most of the militias now, people who has been fighting with the different militias just because they need an income, and to survive you have to fight. And this is economy of poverty, which dictate the future of many Syrian and the fate of young Syria right now. It's need an overall strategy to look into not only political change, but also economic and social change. But the problem that this through the years, now a decade of conflict, it always proven and proven again that Syrian very difficult to be able to negotiate with each other. I'm not only talking about the Syrian opposition and the regime, which is proven to be impossible way, but also within the camp of the opposition itself. We always have different military group, we have different of political fractions, and they need always an outside mediator to do the job on their behalf. And I have seen that before in the Syrian National Council, the Syrian Coalition, and in different parts of different organizations of the Syrian opposition. Can you elaborate more on that? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Radwan. And let me start from Dima's last points about local governance. I totally agree with that. We need Syrians and this is talking from a socio-political, cultural perspective of how to rebuild the culture. This is the Syrian culture that kind of unites Syrians or build trust again among communities. And I think one part of this is that when we build a better governance in non-regime controlled areas, this will help build alternative in the Syrian psyche, especially with those in regime controlled areas, because part of not the cultural concept that's really dominant now in the Syrian more of that the problem is, or the complexity of the Syrian case is that we are dealing also with authoritarian legacies and cultural legacies that was imposed by the regime. And we need to tackle these questions, not only in a military sense, but more of a cultural and rhetorical sense as well. I think so. Building better local governance in non-controlled regime areas are maybe the starting point for Syrians to to overcome the authoritarian legacies that has been imposed on them for the last 5 decades. I think one of the issues that we need to tackle, and that's why I emphasize the bottom-up approach, that, I mean, it's for me become more rhetorical and maybe romanticize if I came and say like Syrians need to solve their problems together. I think it's more than that. We have regional actors now involved, and I cannot shy away from saying that, okay, we need Turkey, we need all actors now. We need the Turkey, US, Iran, and Russia to sit together. I mean, it's unfortunate for us as Syrians to see that the maybe part of the solution comes from above, but at the same time, I think one of the things that we can do is engaging with more Syrians on the ground, and also maybe one of the ways is stopping classifying Syrians into loyalists, non-loyalists, and maybe labeling them into sects, because the material, I mean, while the economic the dire economic situations is really played a role in instigating violence in a way, as you said, Radwan, that more Syrians now into fightings because they have more of a material benefits out of that. And then at the end of the day, also the regime is using siege mentality and the anti-colonial rhetoric in order to more or less homogenize Syrians and use hegemonic discourse in order to legitimize and survive. But at the same time, we need to deal with these internalizations of the regime rhetoric. Like many Syrians might disagree with the regime and they are not loyal to the regime, but at the same time, they don't see an alternative. And I think part of rebuilding a new culture or maybe an alternative culture is having a more of a robust, if I say, local governance in non-regime controlled areas. Another thing is culture, why it is so important. And I think it's hard. I think part of it, it needs time. The time that the regime take for 5 decades to impose an ideology that alters citizens' behaviors and citizens' political judgments is taking time. It's not like a one-night discourse and then we wake up the second day and we say like why we are thinking the same way. And there has been many sayings or more of informally Syrians talking to each other when they say like, the Ba'ath is an idea, but the idea does not die. So it does reflect on how even when you are on the other side of the front, but at the same time you end up using the same tactics, the same strategies, and maybe the same rhetoric, using oppositional terms. So I think rhetoric starts at the beginning with this, the end of polarized narrative, finding common grounds among all Syrians. And I think I have said this before, that if you ask Syrian, even from the loyalist group, those, of course, I'm talking about loyalist group, those who did not commit crimes. If you ask this loyalist group, and what do you wish for Syria? What's the future? What's the future Syria that you want? I am like, I would say 100% sure that we will find common grounds with what he or she wants for Syria and future, that kind of very much be similar to those opposition or Syrians from the opposition ground, that we all want. Even we all want the end of cronyism. We all want the end of patronage networks. And even Syrians within regime-controlled areas are tired of the Iranian presence and the Russian presence. Especially, I'm talking about local Syrians, the Suri al-Adi, the normal Syrians who is like thinking about the challenges on daily basis. So I think improving and updating, reviving our narrative is really important. The second thing is also, as I said before, that we have a whole generation that has grown up in the last 10 years, that they don't know anything about, they don't have allegiance to the Syrian regime, or they don't also know the challenges that we face, us who were born in the 80s and in the 60s. So, but I think we have this will take time. Definitely will take time. It's a long term. It's I think ending the conflict military is the easiest thing for us. but I think the long-term authoritarian legacies and the patronage legacies, and we have to come and into the realization. I think most Syrians know that we have become pawns or tools in the hands of international community. We are asking them to solve the problem, but at the same time, we are part of that problems because we need to work among each other and with each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rahaf. Now we come into the end, 6 minutes after 11:30. I would like to thank all the panelists for wonderful remarks, very informative discussion, Qutaiba, Dima, and Rahaf. And of course, I would like to thank my colleagues at the Arab Center who helped to put all this webinar together, Tamara and Nabil. If you need more information, please visit our website. I'll have more policy papers in Syria, and I would love actually you to join us for any future webinar. Thank you very much and have a good day.